A racist cop humiliates a black man in front of his wife, treating him like a nobody. But when the man reaches into his pocket and pulls out an ID, one that holds the officer's entire career in its hands, what happens next will leave you speechless. Marcus Carter had never been the kind of man to lose his temper. He had spent years mastering the art of patience, especially as a black man in America. He knew how quickly things could spiral if he reacted the wrong way. But tonight, as he gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black SUV, his knuckles white with tension, he felt a storm brewing inside him. The flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror pulsed like an alarm in his chest. His wife, Naomi, sat beside him, her hands trembling in her lap. "Stay calm," he murmured to her, forcing a steady breath. "It's just a traffic stop." Naomi swallowed hard. "Marcus, I don't like this. We weren't even speeding." He knew she was right. They had been driving home from an upscale restaurant celebrating their wedding anniversary. The night had been perfect, until now. The officer approached the driver's side window with an air of arrogance, his flashlight already blinding Marcus before he even had a chance to roll the window down. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice laced with hostility. He was a tall, burly white man with a square jaw and piercing blue eyes that held no warmth. Marcus complied, moving slowly and deliberately, just as his father had taught him when he was 16. He reached for the glove compartment, retrieving the documents with care, making sure to announce every movement. But as he handed them over, the officer's expression twisted into something ugly. His eyes flickered between Marcus's face and the expensive car he was driving. A cruel smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "What's a guy like you doing in a car like this?" he sneered. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had heard it all before. The insinuation, the disbelief that a black man could have nice things without being a criminal. "My wife and I just had dinner. We're heading home," he answered evenly. The officer let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Sure you are. You got drugs in the car?" Naomi let out a sharp breath. "Excuse me." The officer ignored her, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus didn't move. His heartbeat drummed loudly in his ears. "For what?" he asked, his voice still calm, but now edged with steel. The officer's smirk faded. "Because I said so." Marcus exhaled slowly, then opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Naomi gripped his arm, her eyes pleading with him not to resist, not to make a wrong move. As soon as Marcus was on his feet, the officer shoved him against the car, roughly patting him down as if he were a common thug. His hands moved with unnecessary force, his grip bruising. "This car stolen," the officer muttered. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, swallowing the anger that threatened to choke him. "No," he said through gritted teeth. "It's mine." The officer let out a mocking laugh. "Right, and I'm the mayor." Naomi's voice wavered as she stepped forward. "Officer, this isn't right. He hasn't done anything." "Ma'am, step back, or I'll arrest you too," the officer snapped. Marcus turned his head sharply. "There's no reason for this," he said, his voice now edged with a quiet authority that made the officer pause. But only for a second. "You people always think you're above the law," the officer spat, pressing him harder against the car. "You're all the same." And that was the moment. That was when something inside Marcus shifted. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his pocket. The officer stiffened, his hand flying to his holster. "Don't move," he barked. But Marcus didn't stop. His fingers curled around the smooth, familiar object. And as he pulled it out, he held it up for the officer to see. A badge. Not just any badge. A federal badge. The officer's face drained of color. His smirk vanished. Because Marcus Carter wasn't just some guy in a nice car. He was an FBI agent. And this racist cop had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The street was deathly silent. Even the distant hum of passing cars seemed to fade into nothing. The only sound was the sharp intake of breath from the officer as his eyes locked onto the badge in Marcus's hand. His smirk was gone, his arrogance replaced by something that almost looked like fear. Marcus didn't move. He held the badge steady, letting the golden letters glint under the streetlights. Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a long moment the officer said nothing. His jaw twitched, his grip on his holster tightening before his fingers twitched away. "You're lying," he finally spat, but his voice had lost its confidence. Marcus arched an eyebrow, his patience razor-thin. "Really? You think I'd flash a fake FBI badge?" His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge to it now, the kind of authority that sent men like this running. Naomi exhaled shakily, her hand still gripping the edge of the car. "Are we free to go now, officer?" The officer swallowed, eyes darting between Marcus and Naomi. He was scrambling, searching for a way out of the mess he had just stepped into. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. The officer, who had moments ago been so bold, so full of power, now looked unsure, his boots shifting on the pavement. "What's your name, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice like steel. The officer hesitated. "That's none of your damn business." Marcus let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, it's my business now." He held up the badge again, tapping it lightly with his finger. "See, I'm not just any FBI agent. I work in internal affairs. You know what that means?" The officer's throat bobbed. Marcus didn't wait for an answer. "It means I investigate officers like you, the ones who abuse their badge, the ones who think they can harass innocent people because of the color of their skin." He tilted his head slightly. "And from what I just experienced, I'd say we've got a case." Naomi crossed her arms, her confidence returning now that the power had shifted. "And I have everything recorded on my phone," she added. The officer's head snapped toward her. Marcus smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, you didn't know. She's been recording this whole time, every word, every insult, every illegal order." The officer paled. "Now," Marcus continued, stepping even closer, his voice low and measured, "I suggest you tell me your name, because in about 12 hours, my superiors are going to ask me for it." The officer's lip curled, his breath coming faster. "I was just what?" Marcus cut him off. His patience was gone. The anger, the humiliation, the years of men like this treating him like less than a man. It was all boiling over now. Just abusing your power, just racially profiling me, just humiliating me in front of my wife. He took another step forward, and for the first time since the stop began, the officer actually took a step back. "That's funny," Marcus continued, "because I was just on my way home. I was just enjoying my anniversary. I was just minding my damn business, until you decided that a black man in a nice car must be a criminal." The officer clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. But he had no words. Because what could he say? That he had messed up? That he had picked the wrong man to harass tonight? Marcus shook his head. "Your badge number, now." The officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before muttering, "Badge 4721. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Now get out of my way." For a moment it seemed like the officer might resist. His pride was still there, warring with his fear. But he wasn't stupid. He had already lost. With a sharp exhale, he took a step back. Marcus didn't waste another second. He walked back to his car, shoulders squared, his wife right beside him. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and without another glance at the officer, pulled back onto the road. For the first time since the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, Marcus felt in control again. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because tomorrow, Officer 4721 was going to wake up to a nightmare. The drive home was silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence that Marcus and Naomi shared when they were lost in their own thoughts, but a heavy, suffocating quiet, thick with unspoken words. Naomi sat with her arms wrapped around herself, her fingers tapping against her arm in a nervous rhythm. Marcus gripped the wheel, his jaw tight, his mind racing. When they finally pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, Naomi let out a shaky breath. "Marcus, are you okay?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face before nodding. "Yeah, just—" He shook his head. "I knew racism was still alive and well, but that was something else." Naomi scoffed, her voice sharp with emotion. "He enjoyed it. The way he humiliated you, the way he smirked, like he was untouchable." She turned to look at him, her eyes shining with anger. "But he's not untouchable, Marcus. You have the power now." Marcus nodded, his mind already working. "And I plan to use it." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts before hitting dial. The line rang twice before a deep, commanding voice answered. "Carter, what's going on?" Marcus straightened. "Director Harris, I have something you need to see." A pause. Then, "You wouldn't be calling me at this hour unless it was serious." "It is. I was just pulled over by a cop who abused his power, racially profiled me, and humiliated me in front of my wife. And I have it all on record." Silence. Then the sound of a chair creaking as the director sat forward. "Where are you now?" "At home." "Send me the footage. Now." Marcus looked at Naomi. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone, pulled up the video, and sent it over. Within moments, Director Harris had it. A long, slow exhale came through the speaker. "Jesus." Marcus remained silent, waiting. Finally, Harris spoke again. "This officer, do you have his badge number?" 4721. "Name?" "He refused to give it, but I'll find it." "You won't have to," Harris muttered. "Give me an hour." Marcus ended the call and set the phone down. He turned to Naomi, his expression unreadable. She studied him for a long moment. "What's going to happen now?" Marcus leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "That cop thought he could get away with it because he's been getting away with it his whole career." He turned to her, his voice steel. "That ends tomorrow." The next morning, the sun rose like any other day. But for Officer Daniel Reynolds, everything was about to change. He strolled into the precinct, coffee in hand, the same smug arrogance he carried everywhere still plastered across his face. The night before had been nothing to him. Just another black man put in his place. He had done it before, and he'd do it again. But when he stepped inside, the atmosphere was off. Officers whispered in hushed tones, stealing glances at him before quickly looking away. Some even took a step back as he passed, his brows furrowed. What the hell is going on? Then, he saw them, 3 men in suits standing by the captain's office, and in the middle of them, Marcus Carter. Reynolds stopped dead in his tracks. His stomach twisted into knots. No, this couldn't be happening. His hands instinctively clenched as Marcus turned around, locking eyes with him. And for the first time in his career, Reynolds felt something he had never felt before. Powerless. Marcus took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable, his badge clipped neatly to his belt. "Officer Reynolds," he said smoothly. Reynolds' throat went dry. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Why don't you step into the captain's office? We have some things to discuss." Reynolds forced himself to scoff, trying to recover. "I don't have time for this." "Now." The command in Marcus's voice sent a chill down Reynolds' spine. And just like that, the tables had turned. Officer Daniel Reynolds had walked into the precinct that morning feeling invincible. He had spent years throwing his weight around, using his badge as both a weapon and a shield. Men like him didn't face consequences. But now? Now he sat in the captain's office, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight, as 3 federal agents stared him down. At the head of the room, Captain Dawson sat stiffly behind his desk, his face pale. He wasn't a good man. He had turned a blind eye to Reynolds' behavior for years, but even he looked shaken. And then there was Marcus. Unlike Reynolds, he wasn't tense. He wasn't nervous. He was calm. And that calmness, steady, unshaken, was more terrifying than any anger Reynolds had ever faced. Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "You know why you're here, Officer Reynolds?" Reynolds scoffed, trying to play it cool. "This is ridiculous. You're blowing a simple traffic stop out of proportion." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes sharp. A simple traffic stop. He glanced at one of the agents beside him, who handed him a file. Marcus flipped it open, revealing a printed transcript. "Let's go over some of your words from last night, shall we?" Reynolds stiffened. Marcus read aloud, his voice steady. "What's a guy like you doing in a car like this? You got drugs in the car. You people always think you're above the law." He shut the file and let the silence hang in the air. Reynolds's mouth twitched. "That recording is illegal." "Actually," Marcus interrupted, his voice smooth as glass. "In this state, only one party needs to consent to a recording. My wife consented." He leaned forward slightly. "So legally?" "That recording is airtight." Reynolds swallowed hard. Captain Dawson cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Agent Carter, is this really necessary? I mean, let's be reasonable." Marcus turned his gaze to him, and Dawson immediately fell silent. "Captain Dawson, I don't think you realize the severity of this." Marcus's voice was controlled, but there was a sharp edge to it. "I work in internal affairs. This isn't just a complaint. This is a federal investigation." Dawson paled even further. Marcus turned back to Reynolds. "You see, we don't just have last night's footage." He gestured to one of the agents, who placed a thick folder on the table. "We have years of reports on you, Officer Reynolds. Dozens of complaints. Racial profiling, unlawful searches, excessive force, and somehow, every single one of those cases was dismissed." Reynolds said nothing. Marcus's voice dropped lower. "Tell me, do you know what happens when the FBI finds a pattern of civil rights violations by a police officer?" Reynolds' fingers twitched. He did know. Marcus continued, his voice almost casual. "It's not just a badge you lose, it's prison time, federal charges, and with a case like this, the Department of Justice is going to eat you alive." Reynolds shot up from his chair. "You can't do this." The two agents beside Marcus moved slightly, prepared to intervene, but Marcus simply held up a hand. He stayed seated, looking up at Reynolds with nothing but power in his eyes. "Oh, I can. And I already have." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded document, and slid it across the table. Reynolds's hands trembled as he picked it up. His eyes darted over the words, and then his face turned to stone. It was a notice of immediate suspension, signed, sealed, effective immediately. "Pack your things, Reynolds," Marcus said quietly. "You're done." The weight of it hit Reynolds all at once. His career, his entire life, had just crumbled in a matter of seconds. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. His voice wavered, his confidence cracking. This isn't happening." But it was. Marcus stood up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. "I'd say I hope you learned something from this," he said, his voice cool. "But men like you never do." Reynolds looked around desperately, but no one, not the captain, not the officers outside who had once feared him, stood up for him. For the first time in his life, Daniel Reynolds was alone. Marcus turned to leave, his job done. But just as he reached the door, he paused. One last thing. He turned back, meeting Reynolds' eyes one final time. "You told me last night that people like me think we're above the law." He let that settle before delivering the final blow. "Well, Officer Reynolds," he smirked, "it looks like you're the one who thought he was untouchable." And with that, Marcus walked out. The weight of the moment pressed down on Officer Reynolds like an avalanche. He stood frozen in the captain's office, gripping the suspension letter so tightly that the paper crumpled in his fists. The smugness, the power, the control he once wielded, it was all gone. Marcus Carter didn't just strip him of his badge. He had shattered the illusion Reynolds had built around himself. As Marcus walked out of the office, the entire precinct seemed to watch in silence. Officers who once nodded at Reynolds with respect now avoided his gaze. Some whispered to each other, while others simply shook their heads. No one stepped up to defend him. Reynolds turned toward Captain Dawson, grasping at any last shred of authority he could find. "You're just going to let them do this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Dawson, still pale, let out a slow breath. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I should have done something about you years ago," he muttered, his voice laced with something between regret and exhaustion. "You brought this on yourself, Reynolds." Reynolds' mouth opened, but no words came out. He had spent so long believing he was invincible, that his badge was a shield, protecting him from any consequence. But now, he was nothing. He stormed out of the office, the paper still clenched in his fist. Every step felt heavier than the last. As he reached his desk, he saw a brown cardboard box already sitting there. Someone had packed up his things. The humiliation was suffocating. An officer he had once mentored, one he had taught to show no weakness, stood by, his expression unreadable. Reynolds glared at him. "You think this is funny?" The younger officer shook his head. "No," he said simply. "I think it's about time." Reynolds's blood boiled, but there was nothing left to say. He grabbed the box, shoving his belongings inside. His badge, his gun, his nameplate. It was all useless now. As he walked toward the exit, he saw Marcus standing near the front doors, talking to one of the agents. Marcus glanced up, locking eyes with him. Reynolds knew that look. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't arrogance. It was finality. Marcus had won. Reynolds shoved the door open and stepped outside into the cold morning air. It should have felt fresh, free. But all he felt was the crushing weight of reality settling onto his shoulders. For the first time in his life, Officer Daniel Reynolds was no longer above the law, and the world had no sympathy for men like him. Marcus exhaled as he watched Reynolds disappear down the steps of the precinct. He could feel the tension leaving his body, the weight of the past 24 hours finally lifting. Naomi's voice echoed in his mind from the night before. "You have the power now." And she had been right. He hadn't just taken down a racist cop. He had sent a message. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marcus turned to the agent beside him. "I want everything he's done investigated. If there are victims out there, people he's hurt, we find them. We give them justice." The agent nodded. "Already on it." Marcus nodded, satisfied. He pulled out his phone and called Naomi. She picked up on the first ring. "How did it go?" Marcus smiled, looking out at the city. "It's done." Marcus drove home in silence, his mind replaying every moment from the past 24 hours. The traffic stop, the humiliation, the look on Reynolds' face when he realized he had lost everything. It should have felt like victory, and in some ways, it did. But Marcus wasn't a man who celebrated taking another person down, not even a racist one. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about Reynolds. It was about every person he had ever victimized. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw Naomi waiting on the front porch. The moment he stepped out of the car, she rushed to him, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. He held her close, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. Naomi pulled back slightly, searching his face. For him, maybe. But what about the people he's hurt? The ones who didn't have an FBI badge to protect them? Marcus nodded slowly. That's exactly what I was thinking. He took her hand and led her inside. As soon as he sat down, he opened his laptop and logged into the FBI's internal database. With a few keystrokes, he pulled up every complaint ever filed against Daniel Reynolds. And what he saw made his stomach turn. Dozens of reports. Unlawful searches, excessive force, unprovoked arrests, racial slurs caught on body cam footage that had mysteriously disappeared every single time. And worst of all, not a single case had ever resulted in disciplinary action. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as Naomi leaned over his shoulder, reading the same damning reports. "This isn't just one bad cop," she whispered. "This is a system protecting him." Marcus exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. Not anymore. He started making calls, first to the Department of Justice, then to civil rights attorneys who specialized in police misconduct cases, then to journalists, the kind who wouldn't let this story die in a news cycle. By the end of the day, the wheels were in motion. A federal investigation was officially opened against Reynolds. Every one of his past cases was being reviewed. The people he had wrongfully arrested, some of them were about to have their records wiped clean, and by the time the evening news aired, the entire country would know his name. The next morning, Marcus and Naomi sat on their couch, coffee cups in hand, watching the news unfold. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Racist officer under federal investigation after targeting FBI agent in traffic stop." Naomi let out a low whistle. They didn't hold back. The footage from her phone played, Reynolds sneering, humiliating Marcus, shoving him against the car. And then, the moment where Marcus calmly pulled out his badge and shattered the officer's entire world. The news anchor's voice was grave. "This incident has sparked outrage, bringing renewed attention to police misconduct. Multiple victims have come forward with similar allegations against Officer Reynolds. The Justice Department has confirmed that a full investigation is underway." Marcus glanced at his phone. Missed calls. Dozens of them. Some were from reporters, some from colleagues, some from strangers, people who had been on the receiving end of Reynolds' abuse, finally finding the courage to speak up. Naomi squeezed his hand. "You started something bigger than just last night, Marcus." He nodded slowly. "Good. Because this was justice, not just for him, but for all of them." 3 weeks had passed since that fateful night, and the fallout had been swift and unforgiving. Officer Daniel Reynolds was no longer a cop. His suspension had turned into a permanent termination after the federal investigation unearthed an avalanche of corruption. But it didn't stop there. Marcus sat in his office at the FBI headquarters, scrolling through the latest updates on his laptop. 14 victims had come forward, black men, Latino men, and even some young white men from poor neighborhoods, all with eerily similar stories. Pulled over for no reason, searched unlawfully, beaten, arrested, or humiliated. And now? Reynolds wasn't just fired. He was facing federal charges. Former police officer Daniel Reynolds indicted on civil rights violations and excessive force, the news headline read. Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of it sink in. It wasn't just Reynolds. The DOJ had expanded the investigation into the entire precinct. Several other officers, ones who had covered for Reynolds or participated in similar misconduct, were now under scrutiny. Some had already been placed on administrative leave. Others were resigning before they could be exposed. The system that had protected Reynolds for years, it was finally crumbling. A knock at the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. He looked up to see Naomi standing there, a small smile on her lips. "Busy?" she asked. Marcus shook his head, gesturing for her to come in. "Just reading up on the latest." She walked over and glanced at his screen. So, it's really happening? Marcus exhaled. Yeah, Reynolds is done. His lawyers are trying to fight it, but with all the evidence stacked against him. He's going to prison, Naomi. Real prison. Not some slap-on-the-wrist desk job after a disciplinary review. Naomi crossed her arms, shaking her head. I still can't believe it took this long for someone to stop him. Marcus frowned, his jaw tightening. Because no one with enough power ever stood up to him before. That's how guys like him keep getting away with it. Naomi sat down across from him, her expression softening. But you changed that, Marcus. You didn't just take him down. You made sure his victims got justice. Marcus nodded slowly. He knew she was right, but the weight of everything still sat heavy on his chest. Naomi reached for his hand. You okay? He hesitated for a moment before finally nodding. Yeah, just thinking about how many others like him are still out there. Reynolds wasn't some lone wolf. He was a symptom of a much bigger disease. Naomi squeezed his hand. Then keep fighting. You've already proven that the system can be held accountable. Imagine what else you can do. Marcus looked at her, a small smile creeping onto his lips. You always know what to say, don't you? She smirked. That's why you married me. He chuckled, the tension in his chest finally easing. Just then, his phone buzzed with a call. He glanced at the screen. It was his superior, Director Harris. Marcus met Naomi's eyes. Looks like the fight's just getting started. She smiled. Then go do what you do best. Marcus picked up the phone. Agent Carter speaking. As the call began, one thing was clear. His work wasn't done. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, change was finally happening.